Dakota Territory, late summer of 1887. The air was thick with the dust of 1,000 harvested acres, and the sun baked the plains a uniform shade of brittle gold. On a small claim west of Aberdeen, a man named August Thorson was building his house, and he was building it wrong. At least, that was the considered opinion of every man who rode past. They saw a stone foundation, which was proper enough. They saw a sturdy timber frame, the work of a man who knew his tools. But they did not see logs being stacked, nor sod bricks being cut. They saw August Thorson, his face grim with effort under the prairie sun, stacking enormous, tightly bound bales of straw. He was building a house of hay. The absurdity of it was a constant source of amusement at the general store. Men who had spent years mastering the tight joinery of a log cabin or the precise layering of a sod house would shake their heads and chuckle. They called it Thorson's folly. Some, with a darker sense of humor, called it the tinderbox. August heard the whispers. He saw the smirks. But he just kept working. His movements deliberate, his jaw set. He was not building a joke. He was building a fortress against a killer he knew was coming. What did this quiet Norwegian farmer understand about the Dakota winter that every seasoned frontiersman had tragically missed? The answer would be written not in words, but in ice and fire, and it would save them all. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten genius, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from today. To understand August Thorson's madness, you first have to understand the enemy. The Dakota winter was not merely cold, it was an active, malevolent force. It arrived in November not as a gentle transition, but as an invasion. The wind came first. A relentless, soul-stealing gale that blew across hundreds of miles of flat, unbroken land, gaining speed and fury with every mile. It found every crack, every seam, every pinhole in a man's home. Then came the cold. It was a physical presence, a weight that settled over the landscape and did not lift for 5 months. Temperatures of 20 below zero were common. 40 below was not unheard of. It was a cold that split century-old oak trees with a sound like a rifle shot. It froze ink in its wells and turned a cup of tossed water to ice before it hit the ground. The settlers fought back with the only weapon they had, fire. Their homes were built around the cast iron stove, a hungry god that demanded constant tribute. The conventional wisdom dictated 2 types of construction. The first was the log cabin, a symbol of the frontier, romanticized by those who had never lived in one. They were strong, yes, but they were thermal sieves. The logs themselves, once frozen solid, conducted the cold inward. The chinking, a mixture of mud and grass, would shrink and crack, opening dozens of tiny mouths for the winter wind to howl through. A family in a log cabin lived in a small bubble of warmth a few feet from their stove. Venture more than 10 feet away, and the temperature would plummet. Frost would bloom on the interior of the walls, a beautiful and deadly filigree of ice. Blankets on the beds would grow stiff with a frozen rime from the sleeper's own breath. The consumption of wood was terrifying. A homesteader might spend his entire autumn cutting and splitting a massive woodpile, only to see it vanish by January, forcing him into desperate, life-threatening trips into the frozen wilderness for more fuel. The second option was the sod house, or soddy. Built from thick bricks of prairie earth, These homes were common where timber was scarce. They were superior to log cabins in one respect: thermal mass. The thick earthen walls were slow to lose heat, but they had their own insidious flaws. They were perpetually damp, weeping moisture in the summer and freezing into solid blocks of earth in the winter. They were dark, with few windows, and they were a haven for mice, snakes, and insects that burrowed into the walls and ceiling. In a long, cold snap, the frozen dampness became a unique form of misery, a chilling cold that seemed to radiate from the very structure of the home itself. August Thorson had seen this suffering during his first winter. He had watched neighbors burn through their wood by New Year's. He had seen children with persistent, rattling coughs and mothers with chapped, bleeding hands from washing clothes in barely lukewarm water. He had seen the exhaustion on the faces of the men, their lives reduced to a desperate, back-breaking cycle of feeding the stove. He knew there had to be a better way. August was not an engineer or an architect. He was a farmer, born and raised on the windswept coast of Norway, a place that understood long, dark winters. He had grown up in stone farmhouses with thick walls and sod roofs that were not just laid on top, but were an integral part of the home's insulation. He understood a principle that the American frontiersmen, for all their ingenuity, had overlooked. They were trying to fight the cold with heat. August knew you had to fight the cold with insulation. You did not conquer the winter by burning more wood. You conquered it by building a wall so thick, so full of trapped air, that the cold simply could not get in. The idea came to him as he was baling his hay that summer. He lifted a bale, feeling its weight and density. It was just dried grass, the most common and worthless thing on the prairie next to dirt. But it was also a tightly compressed matrix of hollow stems, each one a tiny pocket of trapped air. An entire bale was millions upon millions of these pockets, and trapped air, he knew from the old country, was the greatest insulator in the world. He would not build a house of logs that leaked heat. He would not build a house of damp earth. He would build a house with walls made of trapped prairie air. He would build a house of hay. The construction of Thorson's Folly became a local spectacle. The foundation was conventional, a 2-foot-high wall of fieldstone set in a deep trench below the frost line. On this, August bolted a heavy timber frame, the skeleton of a normal house. This much the onlookers understood and approved of. It was what came next that baffled them. Using a block and tackle rigged to a tall pole, August and his wife, Inga, began hoisting the hay bales. Each bale was 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and 14 inches thick, compressed to a near-solid density by his horse-drawn baler. He laid them like giant bricks, stacking them flat within the timber frame. He took care to stagger the joints, just as a mason would with stone, ensuring there were no direct seams running through the wall. The walls rose with astonishing speed. In a matter of days, the house was fully enclosed. The final structure was monolithic. The walls were a full 3 feet thick. He used sharpened wooden stakes, 2 feet long, to pin the courses of bales together, driving them down through the layers to add stability. At the corners, he drove stakes in at opposing angles, locking the bales into an immovable mass. It was during this phase that Elias Vance made his first visit. Vance was the territory's most respected carpenter, a man from Ohio who had built more than half the structures in the county. He was a good man, honest and hard-working, and his opinion carried immense weight. He arrived on his horse, dismounted, and watched August for a long, silent time. Finally, he spoke. "Thorson," he said, his voice not unkind. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but what you are doing here, it is not right." August paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "It will be warm." Vance shook his head, gesturing at the pale yellow walls. "That's hay, August. It will rot. The first big rain, the first winter melt, and you'll have a 3-foot wall of black mold. It'll sicken your family." "I will cover it," August replied simply. "With what? Wood? You'd need a forest's worth to cover walls that thick," Vance countered. His objection was practical, rooted in his deep experience. "And what about mice? Rats? Every vermin on this prairie will make a home in your walls by Christmas. It's a vertical haystack." "It will be sealed," August said, his tone unwavering. He offered no detailed defense. He simply stated his intention. Vance's final objection was the one that had given the house its darkest nickname. "And fire, man," he said, his voice dropping. "Have you thought of that? A stray spark from the chimney, a tipped lantern, this place will go up like a torch. You're building a death trap for your wife and children." August looked at his half-finished home, then back at the respected carpenter. "It will be safe," he said, and with that, he turned back to his work. The exchange was repeated, in one form or another, all over the county. At the trading post, men laid bets on how long the structure would last. Some said it would collapse under the first heavy snow. Others repeated Vance's concerns about rot and fire. No one believed it would work. August and Inga were isolated, their project a symbol of their strange, old-world foolishness. The sealing of the walls was the final, crucial step. August and Inga spent weeks mixing a thick, heavy plaster. It was not a simple mud mixture. It was a carefully composed render of clay, sand, water, and a generous amount of slaked lime. The lime was the key. It acted as a powerful binder, creating a hard, cement-like shell. More importantly, it was caustic, a natural deterrent to pests and mold. They applied it by hand, pushing the thick plaster deep into the surface of the hay bales, creating an unbreakable bond. They plastered the outside first, a layer nearly 2 inches thick. They worked it around the deep-set window frames and the heavy door, leaving no gaps, no seams, no entry point for moisture or vermin. Once it cured in the sun, it was as hard as stone. Then they did the same on the inside. Another 2-inch layer of lime plaster, troweled smooth. The final result was a house with walls that were nearly 4 feet thick. The hay was not exposed anywhere. It was hermetically sealed inside a breathable but waterproof shell of lime plaster. The windows were small and few, set deep within the massive walls, creating cavernous, sunlit sills on the inside. The system was now complete. It was not just a house made of hay, it was an integrated thermal envelope. The stone foundation prevented moisture from wicking up from the ground. The timber frame provided the structural integrity. The thick plaster shell provided a fireproof, waterproof, and pest-proof barrier. And at the core, the 3 feet of compressed straw acted as a massive, unprecedented blanket of insulation. The physics were simple, yet revolutionary for the time. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of a single inch of straw is roughly 2.5 to 3. A standard 12-inch log wall had an R value of about 15. August's walls, with 36 inches of straw, had an R value of nearly 100. He had built a home that was, in thermal terms, more than 6 times more efficient than the best log cabin in the territory. He had built a passive survival machine. But as autumn turned to winter, his neighbors saw only the folly, the tinderbox, the great hay joke. November arrived with a familiar chill. December brought the first heavy snows. The settlers hunkered down, beginning the long, slow battle against the cold. They stuffed rags into the cracks in their walls, kept their stoves glowing red hot, and began the daily, anxious calculation of their remaining firewood. Then, on January 12th, 1888, the world changed. The day began with an unnerving mildness. The temperature hovered around freezing, a false spring that coaxed children outside without their heavy coats and tempted farmers into making trips to town. But in the northwest, a monster was gathering. A colossal Arctic air mass, a wave of polar cold, was roaring down from Canada, moving with incredible speed. The temperature drop was not gradual, it was a cliff. In the town of Aberdeen, the thermometer at the general store read 30 degrees Fahrenheit at noon. By 3 in the afternoon, it read 10 below zero. An hour later, it was 25 below. The mild air was instantly annihilated, replaced by a savage, impossibly cold wind that the Lakota called the Tate Wiopeyata, the wind from the direction of the dead. It was a blizzard of unprecedented violence. The wind screamed at over 60 miles per hour, picking up the loose snow from the ground and blasting it horizontally. Visibility dropped to zero in an instant. The world beyond a man's front door ceased to exist, replaced by a churning white chaos. It was later called the Children's Blizzard, for the many school children who were caught unawares and froze to death on their way home. For the settlers in their cabins, it was the ultimate test. The wind was a physical assault, shaking the structures to their foundations. It forced fine, powdered snow through impossibly small cracks, dusting the floors and furniture inside. But the cold was the true enemy. The temperature plunged to 40 below zero, and with the wind chill, it felt like 80 below. Inside the conventional homes, life became a desperate struggle for survival. The bubble of warmth around the stoves shrank to a few inches. Families abandoned their separate rooms and huddled together in the main living space, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The iron stoves, designed for normal winters, could not keep up. Men fed them constantly, burning through seasoned oak and poplar at a terrifying rate. The metal would glow cherry red, but the heat seemed to be instantly stolen by the cold that radiated from the walls and poured through the windows. In his expertly built cabin, Elias Vance was facing his own failure. His joinery was perfect. His chinking was less than a year old, but it made no difference. The wind found its way in. A fine mist of snow was building up on the floor beneath his north-facing window. The wall itself felt like a sheet of ice to the touch. He had started the day with a cord of wood stacked neatly by his door, a week's supply in a normal winter. Now he was burning through it in a matter of hours. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 sons were huddled by the stove, their faces pale and anxious in the flickering light. Every hour, Elias would have to bundle himself in his heaviest clothes, take the lantern, and fight his way to his main woodpile, a journey of only 50 feet that felt like a mile. Each time, he returned gasping for breath, his beard a solid block of ice, the cold having stolen a little more of his strength. By the second day of the storm, a grim realization settled upon him. He was losing. At his current rate of consumption, his wood would be gone in less than 24 hours. He had already started eyeing the wooden chairs, the chest of drawers. He looked at the fear in his family's eyes and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His expertise, his reputation, his pride, it was all worthless against this storm. And then a thought intruded, one he had pushed away for months. August Thorson, the fool with the hay house. What was happening in that tinderbox? Vance pictured the worst. He imagined the wind tearing the plaster from the walls, the snow blasting through the straw. He imagined the family frozen, huddled together in a final, desperate embrace. A pang of guilt struck him. He had mocked the man. He had stood by and let him build a tomb for his family. The thought became an obsession. He had to know. Perhaps they needed rescue. Perhaps, by some miracle, they were still alive, and he could bring them here, to the relative safety of his own failing cabin. The motivation was part guilt, part a desperate need to act, to do something other than feed the fire. "I'm going to check on the Thorsons," he announced, his voice hoarse. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't," she whispered. "You'll die out there." "It's not far. I'll follow the fence line," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They might need help. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The 300 yards between his cabin and Thorson's Folly was a polar wasteland. The wind was a solid wall that knocked him to his knees. The snow was not falling. It was a horizontal blast of ice particles that sandblasted his exposed skin. He kept one hand on the top wire of the fence, his only guide in the white void. His lungs burned with every breath of supercooled air. He could feel the warmth draining from his body, his movements becoming slow and clumsy. He was fighting for every single step. After what felt like an eternity, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling chaos. The Thorson house. It stood silent and dark. There was no plume of smoke rising from the chimney, a terrifying sign. Vance's heart sank. He had been right. The stove was out. They were already gone. He staggered to the door, his frozen fingers fumbling with the latch, and pushed it open, preparing himself for a scene of tragedy. The door swung inward, and he was hit not by a wave of cold, but by a wall of warmth. It was a gentle, enveloping heat, so profound and shocking that he actually recoiled. The air smelled of baking bread and warm wool. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the screaming wind, and stood there, blinking in disbelief. The scene before him was impossible. Stay with me, because what Elias Vance saw next would not only shatter his understanding of survival, it would forever change the future of the American frontier. If you're finding this story of ingenuity compelling, hit that like button right now for the YouTube algorithm. The main room of the Thorson cabin was bathed in the soft, steady light of 2 oil lamps. It was an oasis of calm and comfort in the heart of the blizzard's fury. August Thorson sat at his table, mending a piece of leather harness, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His wife, Inga, was pulling a loaf of bread from a small oven attached to the side of the stove. The rich, yeasty steam filled the warm air. But it was the children who broke Vance's mind. 2-year-old Elin was sitting on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. 4-year-old Lars was asleep on a rug near the hearth. Both of them were barefoot. Barefoot, in the middle of the worst blizzard in recorded history. Vance stood there, a frozen statue just inside the door, his ice-caked beard melting and dripping onto the floor. His eyes darted around the room, trying to process the flood of contradictory information. He looked at the windows. There was no frost on the panes, not a single crystal of ice. He could see the faint outline of the deep, cavernous windowsills, dry and clean. He looked at the walls. They were smooth, painted a simple white, and radiated a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. He put a hand to the north wall, the one taking the full, direct punishment of the Arctic wind. It was cool, but it was not cold. It felt like the wall of a cellar in summertime. August looked up from his work, his expression calm, unsurprised. "Elias," he said, his voice even. "Come in. You look cold." Vance finally found his voice, a raw croak. "You're fire," he stammered, pointing a trembling, mittened hand at the stove. It's nearly out." The stove was a small, efficient model, much smaller than Vance's own, and the fire inside was banked low, a bed of gently glowing coals with a single, small log smoldering on top. It was a fire meant for a mild autumn evening, not a polar vortex. It was impossible. "It is enough," August said. Vance's mind, the mind of a practical builder, began to race, searching for an explanation. He was an expert, and his expertise was screaming at him that this was a lie, a trick. He began to investigate. He walked over to the stove, feeling the gentle heat it was producing. It was nothing, not nearly enough to heat a cabin in these conditions. He looked at the wood box next to the stove. It was full to the brim with neatly stacked, split logs. This was the data point that broke him. This was the inarguable number that shattered his worldview. In his own home, a home built with the pinnacle of known frontier craftsmanship, he was burning a log every 15 minutes just to stay alive. His wood box was perpetually empty. This family, in their hay house, had a full wood box and a fire that was barely lit. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began?" Vance asked, his voice shaking with the force of the revelation. August considered the question for a moment. "6 logs, I think," he said. "Maybe 7. Inga used 2 this morning for the bread. 7 logs. In 2 days. Vance felt dizzy. He had burned more than that in the last 3 hours. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was not in a theory or an argument. It was in the barefoot children on the floor, the full wood box, the single smoldering log. It was in the quiet, life-sustaining warmth that filled the room. He turned back to August, the mockery and doubt he had felt for months replaced by a profound, humbling awe. He saw not a fool, but a genius. He saw a man who had faced the same enemy, but had understood it on a level he could not even comprehend. Elias Vance, the territory's finest carpenter, the voice of conventional wisdom, took off his frozen mittens and looked at the Norwegian farmer. The words came out quiet, but they carried the weight of a complete surrender. "August," he said, "I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong." He paused, the admission hanging in the warm, quiet air. "This house, it's a miracle. Will you teach me how it works?" The blizzard raged for another full day, but inside the hay house, life continued with a calm rhythm that bordered on miraculous. Elias Vance stayed with the Thorsons, unable to face the perilous journey back and, in truth, unwilling to leave the impossible sanctuary August had built. He spent the hours asking questions, his builder's mind absorbing every detail. He learned about the specific density of the bales, how they had to be tight enough to resist compression, but not so tight that they lost their air pockets. He learned about the lime in the plaster, how it was the key to preventing rot and repelling pests. He learned how August had oriented the house, with the fewest windows facing the brutal north wind and a larger window facing south to capture the low winter sun. Every detail was a piece of a brilliant, integrated system. When the storm finally broke, the world it revealed was one of devastation. The landscape was buried under massive drifts of snow. Several homesteaders who had been caught outside were found frozen. Livestock had perished in their barns, and every single family had a story of a desperate, terrifying battle to keep from freezing inside their own homes. Word of what Vance had seen inside the Thorson house spread like wildfire. It started with his own wife, who saw the look of awe on his face when he returned. Then it spread to their neighbors. At first, no one believed it. Barefoot children? A full wood box? It sounded like a fever dream. But Elias Vance was not a man given to flights of fancy. His reputation was unassailable. When he began to speak, people listened. He did not just recount the story, he became the idea's most fervent champion. He used his credibility as a carpenter to explain the principles. "We've been fighting the cold all wrong," he told a group of stunned men at the general store a week later. "We've been building walls to hold up a roof. August Thorson built walls to hold out the winter. The house isn't just a shelter, it's a tool. It works for you." That spring, a revolution in construction began in the Dakota Territory. Two families whose cabins had been severely damaged in the blizzard approached August. Hesitantly, they asked if he would help them build a house like his. August, a man who sought no fame, simply nodded and agreed. But this time, he was not alone. Elias Vance was there, his tools at his side. The partnership was transformative. August understood the core principles of insulation and thermal mass. Elias understood framing, bracing, and roofing. Together, they refined the design. Elias designed a better roof truss system that could bear the heavy snow load without compressing the bale walls. He devised a clever system of wooden pins and wire to tie the bales together even more securely. The two new houses went up that summer. Thorson's Folly was no longer a name spoken with ridicule. It was now the Thorson method, spoken with respect. The community, which had once mocked him, now came to watch and to learn. They saw the speed of the construction, the low cost of the materials. Straw was practically free, and they remembered the terror of the January blizzard. The following winter was the final proof. While it was not as severe as the Great Blizzard, it was a typical, brutal Dakota winter. And the two families in their new Hay-Bale houses lived in the same impossible comfort the Thorsons had. They cut their firewood consumption by over 75%. Their children were healthier. Their lives were not a constant, exhausting battle for survival. The idea spread. Within 5 years, more than a dozen Hay-Bale homes dotted the landscape. They became the new standard for settlers who wanted to survive and thrive on the northern plains. The design was adapted and modified, but the core principle, super insulation using a cheap local material, remained. The real impact was not measured in cords of wood or degrees of temperature. It was measured in human lives, in babies who survived their first winter, in mothers who had the time and energy to educate their children instead of just stoking a fire. It was measured in the simple, profound dignity of being warm and safe in your own home. August. Thorson never sought a patent. He never asked for payment for his knowledge. He remained a quiet farmer, content to see his family safe and his neighbors secure. He had faced down ridicule with stoic patience and had been vindicated by the unforgiving laws of physics. The story of August Thorson's Hay House is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not born in laboratories or universities, but on the windswept plains, out of necessity and a deep understanding of the natural world. It shows that established wisdom can be a trap, and that the strange, foolish idea of an outsider might just be the key to survival. The principles he used, super insulation, thermal mass, passive solar alignment, are now the cornerstones of modern energy-efficient building science. What was once Thorson's folly is now simply called smart design. If this story of frontier ingenuity inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more forgotten history. And let me know in the comments, what is the single cleverest piece of low-tech engineering you have ever seen? I look forward to reading your answers. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account inspired by the real history of straw bale construction on the American plains in the late 19th century. While the characters and specific events have been created for dramatic purposes, the engineering principles and the historical context are based on factual accounts. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.